Well, thanks everybody for joining us for our Black History Month webinar featuring Dr. Spencer Crew. We did have some technical difficulties in our first go round, and so we just thank Dr. Crew for setting some time aside during this very busy month for him to re-record for us the presentation that he gave on February 10th. Following this, you will see the question and answer session that happened that day, so make sure that you stick around for that. But at this time, I want to introduce Gina Streety from the Office of State Human Resources.
Thank you, Ryan. Dr. Spencer R. Crew has worked in public history institutions for more than 30 years. He is currently the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of History at George Mason University. Before Mason, he served as president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center for 6 years and worked at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian Institution, for 20 years. 9 of those years, he served as director of NMAH. In 1987, he curated his first major exhibit for the NMAH, Field to Factory, Afro-American Migration, 1915 to 1940, and wrote the accompanying book. The exhibition stimulated widespread interest in the subject, inspired films, symposia, and several new books, and was so popular that it became a permanent NMAH installation. It was the first of several successful Crew exhibitions. He most recently served as the interim director at the National Museum of African American History and Culture until January 2021. At each of those institutions, he sought to make history accessible to the public through innovative and inclusive exhibitions and public programs. Crew is a highly sought-after public speaker. He has published extensively in the areas of African American and public history. He is the author of several books, including Field to Factory, Afro-American Migration, 1915-1940, Black Life in Secondary Cities, a comparative analysis of Black communities of Camden and Elizabeth, New Jersey, 1860 to 1920, and Thurgood Marshall, A Life in American History. Crew also curated numerous exhibitions, the most recent one at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He is a graduate of Brown University and holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Rutgers University. Thank you, Dr. Crew.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And today I'd like to start to talk about the slave narratives that were created back in the 1930s. But first I want to talk a little bit about museums and how we can see how museums connect to the slave narratives. Working at museums, one of the things we talk about a great deal is the whole idea of provenance. And that is trying to figure out the life history of an object and what aspect of that life history we would want to include or use to indicate how important that object is. In so doing, the problem is that these objects often have a very complicated history, and you don't know which part of it to choose from. And sometimes what happens is that it allows us to sometimes focus on the wrong aspect of that object. For example, let's take a look at this block, the slave block, next slide, that was located in Hagerstown, Maryland. For many years in that city, it was on display with this label on it, which said General Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay spoke from this slave block in Hagerstown in the year 1830. From this viewpoint, the most important attribute of this piece of artifact was that these politicians and a former president spoke from this object. But little emphasis was given to the fact that many enslaved people who had their lives destroyed on this rock. This is a slave auction block, and on this block, many families were sent in different directions, probably never to see one another again. There are mothers who cried at being separated from their babies, husbands who were torn apart by being separated from their wives and their families, and tears were shed for people never to see each other once again. Now, it's not unusual that this rock was focused on the lives of the politicians. And it's not unusual that the lives and the voices of enslaved people are often treated and overlooked in the telling of history of the United States. They're often lost or forgotten or ignored or are considered unimportant to the larger American history. But let me explain to you why this has been the case, especially in the instance of people who were enslaved. For many years, our understanding of slavery was dominated by historians with a very particular point of view, a point of view in which they were very sympathetic to the ideas and the thoughts of Southerners or individuals who were sympathetic to the institution of slavery. As a consequence, these scholars, these people studying these time periods, really were looking at slavery from the point of view of the person who was the enslaver, not of the enslaved. It's sort of a way of the outside looking in at an issue rather than from the inside looking out. So what you're doing is looking at it from the point of view of individuals who benefited from this institution. But it's not surprising to see this, because what we have to remember is how important the institution of slavery was to the United States in the 19th century. Next slide. If you were to combine the economic value of America's banks, America's railroads, and all of America's manufacturing, it would not equal the economic worth of the enslaved in the nation at that time. They were worth about $3 billion. At the same time, the U.S. produced about 7/8 of all the cotton produced in the world. Next slide, please. And so that cotton production was a very critical part of the economy of the United States. And it made the United States a very powerful economic force in the world, and the South a very important economic force in this country. It's important to keep in mind, though, that cotton was not only important to the South, but it was also important to other parts of the country. Next slide, please. For example, there were businesses and enterprises in the North for whom cotton was an important part of the goods they produced. Also, there were people in the North who were very much involved in the slave trading business. So for them, keeping slavery alive was a very important thing to do. This gives us a sense of the influence and point of view of many of the early interpreters of slavery. For them, slavery was a critical part of the economy. And what happens is that this impacted their approach on their research and their research analysis. Next slide. It meant they drew primarily on sources that were created by slaveholders and people who were sympathetic to the institution of slavery. They used their records, their books, their diaries, their speeches, and autobiographies like what you see in front of you, and also newspaper articles, congressional speeches, and observations by travelers to help influence how they looked at these issues. This, as a result, their views range from regarding slavery as a necessary evil to arguing that it's actually a positive good for everyone involved. How they rationalize this view is very insightful. Some use the concept of what is called the mud sill theory. The idea is that at the foundation of every structure, there's a mud sill upon which it's set. This is the very first layer put down on which a solid foundation is built. The mud sill is important to the stability of that structure, but they're not the key part of the building. The key part is the part above ground that you can see. In society, the South argued that things worked in a similar fashion. As one Southern congressman explained, next slide, in all societies, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. This class, he said, is the mudsills, and their purpose was to provide this basis for the society, but they're not critical to its operation. And it's okay from this point of view because as a mudsill, the enslaved really didn't have the intelligence or the ability to do anything other in that society. In fact, many people argue that bringing them to America from Africa was a net benefit to them. Otherwise, they would have lived a barbaric life, next slide, existing in huts and studying pagan religions. But that by bringing them to America, as you can see in the contrast of these two slides, it changed their lives for the good. In fact, what slaveholders believed, they had done them a favor. And so we can see, wrapped within this mudsill theory then, arguments that for the innate inferiority of enslaved Americans, that they were lesser than everyone else. Some slaveholders were not even sure they were human beings like their white counterparts. And they put forward positions by people like Thomas Jefferson and others where they argued that slavery was a net benefit for the enslaved and that they were actually rescued by being brought to civilized America where they could learn a better life and get away from the barbaric life they lived in Africa. For them, life as an enslaved person had a net positive good side to it. Next slide. They were given food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for their labor. And there was genuine affection between the enslaved and their enslavers. They were like one large happy family on the plantation. Of course, the slaveholder was the parent, and the enslaved were childlike workers. And it was the task of the parent to make sure the children behaved properly when they got out of hand. And they needed to be corrected sometimes by the enslaver. In the mind of the slaveholder, the enslaved preferred enslavement over freedom because they knew they would not survive well on their own. It's the idea of the Southern happy slave that you see in this image. Now, I will not suggest that all scholars accepted all the ideas put forth by enslavers, but I will suggest the slaveholder's point of view had a major impact on how scholars perceived slavery. For them, it was not a blight on American society, but a necessary system in which the broad view of slavery benefited all who were a part of it. Now, because of this, they began to follow, the scholars did, the ideas of one particular historian. And his name was that of U.B. Phillips. Next slide, please. U.B. Phillips was born in Georgia and trained at Columbia University, where he got his PhD in history. His writings really dominated the perspective on Southern slavery and slavery for the most part of the 20th century. His writings praised plantation owners and denied that they were brutal. He said they provided adequate food, clothing, housing, medical care, training to how to function in a modern technology. For him, the plantation was the school which helped civilize the enslaved. The problem was those who were in school never graduated and weren't paid or supported for their work. He said he employed a very social science approach to this history, that he used the best possible hard evidence sources, as he called them, to make for authentic interpretations of history. He would turn to written object sources above any other resource. Consequently, next slide, he downplayed the writings of individuals who were enslaved who talked about their lives as slavery, people like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman. He said they were biased in their opinion and not really trustworthy for what they said because what they were writing was propaganda that did not properly reflect life under slavery. And for years, Phillips stood as the dominant scholar on the topic of slavery. As a consequence, he blocked out the voices of others who might have had a different point of view. Next slide. He especially blocked out the voices of African-American scholars like George Washington Williams, who you see on the left, and W.B. Du Bois. He argued exactly the opposite about slavery that Phillips argued. They said that slavery was oppressive, it was humiliating, and it was a difficult life for the enslaved, and that the enslaved were not happy and would have preferred freedom over slavery. It's almost by accident that a body of information different from that of U.B. Phillips came to the surface. It really was a result of the arrival of the Great Depression in the 1930s. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to office, he created a number of programs to give work to try to revitalize the economy. One of these activities that he put in place, next slide, was called the Works Progress Administration. Its role was to give work to the unemployed. And this was easier to do for people who were lawyers, people who were carpenters, people who were plumbers, because they had a real task that they could do. The bigger challenge was finding work for people like historians like myself, social workers, and others whose real talent was doing research or writing papers. To really find something for them to do, what he created was what was called the Federal Writers Project. He did this in 1935. It was to provide work for historians and teachers and writers and other white-collar workers. The initial task was to create a series of publications called the American Guide Series, which you can see on the screen before you. Its role was to highlight the cultural, economic, and historic resources in different parts of the country. The part of the task was to identify and to begin interviewing and to capture the life histories of older residents of the United States. The hope was to create an anthology of their stories. The result was the creation of the largest first-person narrative project in the history of the country. As part of this work, interviewers in Florida and other southern states were encouraged to interview older African Americans. What they began to find out as they began to look at these different interviews was that many of these people who interviewed, next slide, were formerly enslaved people like Mary Reynolds, who were sharing their experiences under slavery. And they were really giving us a look at slavery from a very different point of view. The head of the project, John Lomax, who was an anthropologist, was intrigued by this, and he began to encourage people to do more of these kinds of interviews. What he tried to do was to give them some sample questionnaires and instructions to these field workers on how to conduct these interviews. And this led to the creation of a slave narrative collection program. And in the end, about 2,300 interviews were assembled by field workers capturing the words and experiences of these individuals. These were supplemented by other earlier interviews that were done by historically black colleges like Fisk University, Southern University, and Kentucky State College. Despite the push from Washington, D.C., the collection of these narratives was really uneven because how much was done really depended upon who was in charge of that state operation. Some states were really eager to do this. Others were very reluctant to do it. So the capturing of this information from state to state was very uneven and not clearly as consistent as they would have liked in Washington. But in the end, they were able to create a rich collection of the words of the last living generation of enslaved people. And this was saved for future generations. In fact, the narratives were preserved, and that they were preserved was important because they were not really immediately seen as valuable by scholars. When the WPA and the Writers Project shut down after about 2 or 3 years, actually 4 years, there was a question as to what to do with them. The states didn't really want them. Instead, in Washington, D.C., they said, send all these narratives to us, and we will decide about preserving them. And what they decided to do was to send them to the Library of Congress for safekeeping. There, the narratives were organized and put into a bound volume, which were entitled, next slide, a folk history of slavery in the United States. And they were located in the rare book section of the Library of Congress. Unfortunately, housing them in the rare book section meant they were hard to get to, that you really had to know they were there. You had to go through a number of steps in order to get access to them, which meant for a long time they existed, but they really weren't looked into very closely by scholars. The other reason that they weren't used very much was because scholars, tended to be very skeptical of oral histories, especially oral histories from people who were not rich and famous or well educated. They felt that these people, under the definition of oral histories, did not have good memories, did not offer accurate depictions of life that they lived, and therefore these kind of testimonies, like the slave testimonies, were not very interesting to historians, especially those who follow U.B. Phillips, because they felt that they really did not offer a good, hard social science look at this institution. They did not believe they gave a fair or accurate portrayal of slavery during that time period. But what helped to change this view of oral history, was the creation of a very important program at Columbia University. Next slide, please. It was launched by a group of highly respected historians who were doing interviews of a wide variety of people. They were doing interviews of politicians, of famous individuals, but also of people, of everyday people, with the idea that their stories, their way of doing things might be worth capturing. It also mattered that we began to look at social history, next slide please, much more closely. What social history does is to look at not only the experiences of the rich and famous, but looking at what workers, women, and the enslaved and other overlooked groups are thinking and feeling about their society, and that their stories had to be an important part of how we began to understand the history of a time period. They might actually offer a view of what was really happening on the ground level as opposed to at the higher levels of government. And this new interest in oral history, I think, spurred a desire to seek new sources of information to learn about the lives of the people at the bottom of society. This shift in focus helped to elevate the value of the slave narratives. Social historians began to dig into these testimonies, seeking to get a different kind of view of the institution of slavery. Not the view of the slaveholders from the outside looking in, but instead the view of the enslaved, looking at slavery from the inside out. From the words of these enslaved people, we began to develop a very different sense of the reality of the institution. And as a consequence, they were offering us a side of the story which slaveholders either overlooked purposefully or actually didn't understand about what life was really like for those who were enslaved. And what we get from this, next slide, is a picture of the strong family and community ties, as well as the hardships and the violence they faced in an economic system that was set up to extract as much labor from them as they possibly could, and a system in which violence and intimidation were used to maintain control over these individuals. This new perspective transformed the way historians assessed the operation and impact of the institution of slavery. A good example is that early historians, UB Phillips School, citing the writings of slaveholders, they used these writings to show how well slaveholders treated their enslaved workers. For example, Joseph A.S. Acklin of Louisiana had some rules printed and shared in which he said was the way in which you should treat those who were enslaved or who were working for you. And then he said, next slide, that it was important that punishment must never be cruel or abusive, for it is absolutely unmanly to whip a Negro for pure passion or malice. So this was used by early historians to show that, in fact, the system of slavery was not that cruel. The slaveholders really put a priority towards treating those who were enslaved more fairly. But we get a different picture of this, and we begin to hear what the enslaved have to say about this institution. For example, Charles Barber, next slide, who you see in this image, was not sure that punishment was given fairly for 4 reasons. He said, and I quote from his narrative, "I can remember when I was small that the slaves were whipped for disobeying, and I can think of several times that I got it. I was doing housework at one time, and one of the silver knives got misplaced. They accused me of misplacing it on purpose. So I got the worst beating that I ever had. I was beaten then till my hide was busted here and there, that he had welts all over his body." Louis Gauze, also of North Carolina, had similar experiences. She said, "I can tell you it was rough in them days. They would beat you about to death. My grandfather and my grandmother, they died with scars on them that the white folks put there." Barber and Gauze were not alone in this assessment of the treatment or the mistreatment of the enslaved. And it was not just the male enslavers who arbitrarily punished the enslaved, as was pointed out by Fanny Griffin of South Carolina. She noted, "My master was good to all his slaves. The Missy Grace was mean to us. She whipped us a heap of times when we ain't done nothing bad to be whipped for. When she got to whip me, she tied my wrists together with a rope and put the rope through a big staple in the ceiling and drew me up off the floor and gave me 100 lashes. I can think about my old mother heaps of times, and now I can see her whipped and the blood dripping off of her." Clearly, there was some discrepancy between what was written by the public consumption of the slaveholders and what happened on a day-to-day basis. I should show you that slide that went with her depiction of what happened to her. Next slide, please. This is how Louise Gauze talked about what happened to her, and an illustration of that. As I say, clearly there's a difference between what the slaveholders were saying publicly versus what was happening behind closed doors. But the difficulties faced by the enslaved were not just physical in nature, they were emotional and psychological as well. What the narratives have to say about the process of getting married is very instructive for us. While the enslaved were encouraged to pick a partner and have a family, making that happen could be a real challenge. Who one wound up with might happen in a variety of fashions, each step of which was subject to the approval of the slaveholder. They reminded slaves in this process of how little control they had over their own lives. Next slide. For instance, the slaveholder could just decide arbitrarily who would be your mate. You have no say in the matter, and love did not play a role in it. This was the case for the parents of John Matthews of Mississippi. He said, "Master Bill just told my mother and father they was to live together, and they had to do like the master told them. They had no choice." If people did desire to marry, they had to get the permission of the slaveholder, and the outcome was not guaranteed. According to Emma Taylor of Texas, The Negro men didn't get the license to marry the gal men. They just picked out the gal they wanted and then asked the gal's master if he would give the gal to him. If he did, they was married. If he didn't, they wasn't. And the man had to find himself another gal. It got even more complicated if the two individuals lived on different plantations. Then they had to ask permission of both enslavers and hope that they agreed. The issue was how the relationship would unfold, as neither slaveholder might not want to lose the labor of one of the individuals. Sometimes to solve this, they might agree to sell one of the two individuals to the other slaveholder so that they could be together. Or they might decide to work on an agreement about visiting schedules so that no labor was lost on either side. This was creating what they called a traveling or an abroad marriage, where the husband most often would travel to see his wife and children 1 or 2 days a week, but had to be back on time for work each day. This was the case for Jasper Battle from Georgia. He said, when my mother and father got married, Master Henry wouldn't let mother and Master Billy wouldn't sell Daddy. So they didn't get to see one another but twice a week. That was on Wednesday and Saturday nights till the war was over. I can still remember Daddy coming over to Master Henry's plantation to see us. But the real irony, I think, about getting married was that it did not guarantee a happily ever after for the couples. The specter of sale always hung over them and any children they might have. Next slide. The slaveholder saw them as property which could be bought and sold regardless of any personal ties they might have. Susan Hamilton of North Carolina witnessed such tragedies. She said all the time, night and day, you could hear men and women screaming to the tip of their voices, and either mother, father, sister, or brother was taken away without any warning and sold. Sometimes a mother who had only one child was separated for life. People were always dying from a broken heart because of this. But it would be unfair to the slave narratives to portray them only as illustrating the pain and the agony and the unhappiness that are part of enslavement. They also help to illustrate the personal connections and the sense of community which the enslaved forged despite the hardships. A wonderful example is the steps they took sometimes to protect each other from harm. Stories they told, the schemes that they crafted while in the fields, things that might be seen by the slaveholder as them being very happy and joyous in their work, but in fact were ways of coping with very difficult situations. For example, it could be the singing that one sees them in the field doing could be seen by the slaveholder as them happily doing the work. But by the enslaved, it had a very different application to it. And it could be used as a way to help them stay safe while the overseer or the slave master is looking for them. There's a wonderful quote that gives us a sense of this from Texas by a man named Yock Stringfield. Please, next slide. What he said was Old Man Jim had a big booming voice, and he always was singing just any kind of song that he had in his head. And he had one that would wail kind of if the overseer was coming. He wailed out loud like and say, "Look along, black man, look along there. Someone's coming shore." If the black boy or women would be lying in the corn row, they'd get up real quick and be mighty busy right soon, because the black snake whip reached out for them real quick if they weren't working. If there's a boy napping under a tree, he scrambled and he got himself together as fast as he could and became the busiest person in the bunch, just so that Master John could see him hard at work. This gives you a sense of how one perception was much different from what the enslaved were experiencing themselves, but how they worked together to try to keep each other safe. The views, I think, that we see here give us a sense of how these perceptions could be very different. You can see this also in the area of religion and religious teaching. The enslavers saw religion as a way to increase their control over the enslaved. Their ministers taught lessons which emphasized obedience and accepting order from your slave masters. For them, the Bible condoned slavery, and according to them, your job was to obey your master. But the enslaved saw the Bible differently, and they saw religion differently. While they responded appropriately when they were in front of the slave master, when they were by themselves, they saw it differently. And for them, the Bible said something very, very different from what they were told in the church of the slaveholder. For them, religion did not reinforce a sense of inferiority or acceptance of their plight. Religion provided a way of navigating their present condition in the hopes of something better, either in this life or in the next. This was evident in the way they practiced their religion away from the sight of the slaveholder. Sometimes they would hold secret services in their cabins out of the sight of the whites. For example, next slide, they would go off to special places in the woods, sometimes called a brush arbor, where they would hold services. One of the traditions they often followed was to bring a large pot or kettle to the gathering and to stick their head into the kettle so your voice would not go on. The idea that the pot would hold that sound so it wouldn't reverberate throughout the plantation. This was said by Anderson Edward of Texas, next slide. He said, "We prayed by ourselves. We didn't want to let the white folks know it, and we wanted to do it. We turned a wash pot down to the ground to catch the voice. And they did not pray to do as the white minister instructed them to do, which was to accept their role as a slave. They prayed for freedom." But I think the most important insight from the narratives are the strong ties that emerged between husbands and wives, parents and children, and their enslaved neighbors. Next slide. When read, these ties are touching and reveal to us how the enslaved found ways to create vibrant families and enslaved communities. They love their families. The love for their families caused them to sometimes defy great hardships to maintain family connections. Tom Morris from North Carolina illustrated this when he talked about his father's determination to see his family. He said, "My mammy said when she lived in Virginia, she belonged to a man first by the name of Robinson. He was a good man, but told her to make some money while living with Mars Robinson is where she met my father. He belonged to another man and would slip off and come to see my mammy and me." Next slide. Sometimes he got a pass and sometimes he didn't. One time the patrollers caught him and he had to hide in a big holler tree. Another time, they put the dogs after him, and he had to run up to a dogwood tree, and they caught him, and they gave him a really bad whipping. But this didn't keep him from coming back to see my mother. This same bond was evident between parents and children, as parents sought to make sure the children knew they were loved, even in the midst of the very difficult environment of slavery. Will Adams talked about his father's efforts to provide love for him. Next slide. "I remember when I was just walking around good, Pop come in from the field at night and take me out of bed and dress me and fed me and then played with me for hours on end just to let me know that he loved me." These moments and bonds were especially invaluable to enslaved children because it made their childhood much more bearable and their bonds to their parents much stronger. Also, I think what we learned from the narratives is that the enslaved were not happy under slavery and did try to gain their freedom when they could, despite the dangers that came from deciding to run. According to Callie Washington of Mississippi, next slide, lots of slaves ran off. I don't know if they went to the north. They said they were going to make it to the free country. Most of them didn't make it there because they never did get them back. By the time that freedom come, most every one of them had gone. My mammy and daddy ran off. I didn't see them no more until after peace was declared. So what we know is that they did not enjoy being enslaved, and they really very much wanted to get their freedom. Consequently, next slide, the real importance of this picture we gain of slavery from the narratives is that there is an alternative view of the institution that they offer to scholars. It causes scholars to begin to question old interpretations of slavery and to offer different perspectives, and became the basis of new interpretations about the experiences of the enslaved. Views that included a sense of a system to the viewpoint of the enslaved people themselves. I think all these perspectives and emotions are very important for us to look at. The slave narratives helped to revolutionize how scholars in the nation thought about and described the institution of slavery. He illustrated how important it is to look for and give credence to less traditional sources of information, and how important it is to dig deeper and to seek perspectives of members of the community who might not be seen as important, but who have an important history to share. It allows new voices and experiences to be heard and to be included. It is when we widen the sources and perspectives we include when trying to do learning, that our sense of history and our understanding becomes much more accurate and realistic. And I think this is what can be learned from the slave narratives, but also I think what is important in terms of what we try to do at the National Museum of American History, because this is the role that we try to play, next slide, at that museum. That is to offer another view of the role of African American history in the United States. Often we say is telling African American history, telling American history through an African American lens, and bring it to the forefront the contributions of African Americans in the evolution of the United States. And it makes sense when we think of the origins of a museum in terms of its history. Well, how it came into being, next slide, was that there were Civil War veterans who came to Washington, D.C. on the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. They were there, but disappointed to see there were no monuments or other things that represented the contributions of African Americans to the United States. And they began to lobby. Their lobbying started at that time, but it took many years before it finally had an impact. And it wasn't until 2003 that a bill was passed creating the National Museum of African American History. At that time, next slide, they hired the director, and they created an advisory board, the head of whom was John Hope Franklin. Lonnie Bunch on the left was the new director. John Hope Franklin was the head of the advisory board. And what he told us, and he told the museum, was that it was important to tell what he said was the unvarnished truth, and make sure that the museum seeks to do this in all that it does. And that was the focus of the museum as it moved forward. The museum opened in 2016 with 3 floors of history exhibits, next slide, and 1 floor of educational activities. You can see that in this vision here. The exhibit slides are C1, C2, and C3. We have a cultural gallery, a community gallery, and also an Explore More gallery, which is where educational activities take place. The history floors look at African American history from the colonial period until the second inauguration of Obama. Next slide. The largest history exhibit looks at slavery and freedom, and really includes in it the legacy of the slave narratives. It looks to tell that story primarily from the perspective of African Americans, both slave and free. As a result, it highlights some very thought-provoking ideas and objects. We look at African nations, as you can see here on the left, and the impact of the slave trade on them. And we have pieces of a slave ship that we located off the coast of South Africa. You can see that in these bars on the right-hand side that were in the bottom of that ship. We also, next slide, discuss the irony of the paradox of the creation of the United States in terms of it's built on the ideas of freedom and liberty, but economically founded on slavery and the enslavement of these individuals. What we also try to do is to highlight the impact of slavery on families and on individuals. Remember the slave block that I talked about? That gives us a sense of how slavery impacts their lives. Sometimes we look at their efforts to escape from slavery through the work of, next slide, the Underground Railroad, and people like Harriet Tubman, whose shawl you see on the left, and sometimes how they try to get away from freedom, from slavery, and get to freedom through rebellion. And we illustrate this is the Bible on the right-hand side that belonged to Nat Turner, who had this rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Also, they sought to get their freedom, next slide, by joining the Army during the Civil War. And this banner you see here is a call to arms to recruit African Americans to become part of the Union Army. And they were a critical part of that army and a critical part of the victory of the Union in that fighting. We also talk about the day-to-day lives of the enslaved, which is shared in a number of ways. Next slide. One is through the slave cabin that you see at the top. It comes from Ediso Island in South Carolina. But also you can see it in terms of the everyday lives of the free. And this tin you see on the right-hand side, which really contains the free papers of a newly freed individual who knew he had to carry that with him and keep him safe when he might be thrown back into slavery. Or we talk about it by looking at the handcuffs on the left that were really created to control a child to make sure that they did not escape from that institution. The many stories that are part of the history of African Americans are woven throughout the exhibitions within the museum, especially that looks at slavery and freedom. I think the museum itself is really dedicated to offering new stories, new perspectives of the history of African Americans. Next slide. And I think visiting it is a very powerful and thought-provoking experience. Our visitors constantly remark about how much they learn as a result of their visits. So as I mentioned earlier, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has parallels to the slave narratives. By examining both entities, one is exposed to a much richer understanding of the African American experience. I would encourage you to learn more about each of them because there is still much to understand about the experiences of African Americans past and present. The slave narratives give us a first-hand look at that, and what the museum tries to do is to take those experiences and to put them in a context where we can understand them better in this life. I hope that each of you might have a chance to come to Washington, D.C., to visit the museum and to experience what it has to offer. And I thank you for the opportunity to share this talk with you.
We do have some time for some Q&A here, and I'd like to ask you some questions. If anyone else has questions, you can go ahead and send them in the chat, and I'm going to rely on Ryan, who's been phenomenal. Thank you, Ryan, for picking up the slides to help with those if they come in the chat. But just to start off, Dr. Crew, for many individuals, there's a lot of discomfort or uneasiness surrounding discussions on race, race relations, racism, and injustice, especially so in recent years. Similarly, there's been some uneasiness in talking about slavery. We often hear things like, well, that was then, this is now, slavery's over, get over it, and move on. And the one that's heard often is, I've never been a slave and you've never been a slave owner, don't apologize to me, or vice versa. Can you address that stance or those stances and any associated anxiety, and share with us how we might collectively navigate these kinds of obstacles to get to meaningful, respectful, and possibly even restorative dialogue?
Well, I think those issues are very much interrelated. That I think the discomfort we have about talking about race and about racism and interracial connections really does connect back to the institution of slavery. Because what slavery did was, and one of the things that it did was to really connect this sense of inferiority, a lesser person, not a full member of society, with color. Because slavery in our nation, if you were a person of color in the nation before the Civil War, the first assumption was that you were a slave, which meant that you were considered to be less of a human being, of less value, less intelligent, and not of the same worth as others in the society. And certainly you weren't a full-scale citizen to be respected. And I think when that emerges with slavery, that continues to flow forward even after the end of slavery. What's is that while we sort of focus our attention on slavery and the end of slavery, what we often forget is that there is a long period after that in which a system of Jim Crow and discrimination continues to exist. African Americans are still forced to struggle to use their rights of citizenship in the years that follow. It was mentioned in the introduction that I've written a book about Thurgood Marshall. And what strikes you about his career, long before he is a judge in the Supreme Court, is that he is the lead lawyer for the NAACP, and he is constantly bringing cases to try to gain back the rights of citizenship for African Americans. And he's worried about segregation in schools, laws that take away the vote, a wide variety of things that continue to work to the detriment of African Americans. I gave a lecture not too long ago about restrictive covenants and housing discrimination. So all those things emerge out of slavery and continue to control and impact the chances for African Americans right up into the present day. And so I think the challenge is for us to recognize that there have been an ongoing set of actions put down as roadblocks to prevent equity within the society. And that if we are a society who believes in liberty, society that believes in justice and freedom, that needs to be applied and available to everyone. And we need to recognize what are the sort of systemic things going on in our society that make it difficult for people to really acquire the kinds of success they'd like to have. And that's a hard conversation to have. And I think it requires that we have empathy towards one another. And I think it requires that we don't look at attacking one another, but listening and learning, and from that growing and becoming, I think, a more empathetic society in terms of the issues faced by others.
Thank you. You just triggered another question that I have based on what you've just shared. There's been a lot of talk and even scholarly articles written about the hereditary nature or genetics of racial trauma. And it's not just nature or nurture, but it's both. What are your thoughts on that? And is that something that we should be looking at more when we start to think about having these kinds of conversations, the emotional state of latter generations of individuals like those you mentioned in your presentation?
I think absolutely, especially if you have a good sense of your family history, or even the short-term issues that members of your family or you have faced society because of your race. That stays with you and has an impact upon how you connect with the outside world. And it's important that, one, that we recognize ourselves what trauma we might have that is impacting us, but that others recognize that there is that trauma, there is a longer history that a person brings with them, memories, let me say memories that people bring with them that have to be accounted for as well. I do believe that they make a big difference in terms of how people navigate the world and how they respond to different challenges that they're faced.
Great, thank you. You mentioned schools in my first question to you. More than a few teachers have found themselves in hot water and making headlines for asking students to do things like portray slaves or participate in mock slave auctions, and even worse, in their attempt to educate on this history. They didn't view it as disrespectful, inappropriate, or even harmful until after they were censured for it. For them, it was just teaching Black history, just like teaching about George Washington Carver or Frederick Douglass. As an educator, how do you feel this topic should be taught in schools? And how do you, or even in homes or churches or wherever anyone is having these kinds of discussions, and how do you respond to that kind of teaching and thinking that I just described?
Well, I certainly think it's a bad idea to have students reenact slavery, especially younger students. They're not going to, I think, get it fully, and it may turn out to be a game, which I think takes away from the severity of that institution. What I think is an interesting, different way to do it, which is not exactly being sold into slavery, is understanding discrimination and labeling people for reasons that don't seem to make a lot of sense. There's a wonderful film out there in which a teacher takes her class, and what she does is to divide the kids up by the colors of their eyes, blue eyes and brown eyes. And then what she did was to let the brown-eyed kids have all the advantages and the blue-eyed kids have no advantages, and then later ask them how they felt about it. And I think what it allowed them to do, without going into race, recognize that it was very arbitrary. Because I have blue eyes, I'm not allowed to have lunch. I have blue eyes because I'm not allowed to play with my friends. And it allows them to understand how arbitrary these kind of things are, and how unfair they are. That you can then sort of talk about other people judge you by that aren't fair. You can talk about race and other kind of things, but it allows the students to first understand the larger underlying issues, and then to attach them to other ways of navigating those questions.
Dr. Crew, we have a question from the chat. Gina, I'm just going to step in here real quick. Question from the chat. Were the ex-slaves that were interviewed asked the same questions during the interview process?
Well, it would depend on, let me do it this way. There were questions sent to all the states from the national office in Washington, D.C. as sample questions, but each state had their own group of people talking to these individuals, and I think they would use the questions as a guideline, but then they might go off in different directions depending upon the answers they got, or depending upon what the interviewer thought might be a more appropriate direction to head. So they weren't all the same questions all the time.
The other question that was asked would be approximately how many ex-slaves were alive when the project was taking place?
Well, they were able to gather up 2,300 interviews. So I say we know there were at least 2,300. There probably were others they didn't get to. But keep in mind that these people who were interviewed by the 1930s had to be children during slavery. So the numbers couldn't have been huge because that's, by the 1930s, that's almost 90 years away. So it's a very narrow group of individuals, but I think getting 2,300 is a pretty good array of people to talk to.
Thank you. Ryan, did you have any more? Well,
no more from the chat. No.
Okay. Well, I can ask another one here. In more recent news, there's been a lot of talk about the Clotilda in Africatown, Alabama, and the descendants of those slaves. Can you speak about that and share why that discovery is so significant? I think it's obvious based on what you've shared in your presentation about the narratives, but is this discovery its own narrative in a sense?
Yeah, I think it is. The Clotilda, you probably all are familiar with it, but I'll just mention they think the last ship to bring enslaved people to the United States. And what happened is that it sank off the coast of Alabama, and quite a few people perished, but also quite a few of the enslaved people of African descent on the ship were able to get to shore. And what's interesting is that many of those people who escaped were enslaved or finally wound up living in what is now Africatown. That's why they call it Africatown. So what you have now are the descendants of many of those individuals who are on the Clotilda who live in Africatown itself. And so I think there's a number of issues of significance connected with it. One is here you have the very last slave ship to come to the New World, to the United States, that you're able to at least identify it. But also for those relatives, those generations that followed, that it gives them a even stronger connection back to their earlier family members. And what's happened is that the members of that town really want to make it a historic space. I don't think they're going to raise the Clotilda. I think it'll stay underwater, but it becomes a historic maritime space. And they want to create a museum or some sort of public place where they can talk about that story and make sure that history and their history is not lost. So I think the significance of it is, once again, allowing voices that might have been overlooked or forgotten to have a permanent place in the memory and in the history of Alabama, of Africatown, but also the United States.
Thank you. Ryan, was there another chat that popped up, a question there? I think yes. I saw it, but okay, go ahead.
A couple of questions. Number one, were sharecroppers considered during the study?
Doing the slave narratives?
Yes.
They really focused on their lives in enslavement. The sharecropping, as you know, comes after that. So there may have been other interviews that spoke to that issue, but the slave narratives specifically wanted to look at the during enslavement and maybe a few years afterwards, a little bit during Reconstruction, but they don't talk a lot about sharecropping, though.
And then one more question. What are your thoughts on the generational wealth gap, with many of the beliefs that Blacks have the same opportunities to education and to gain riches, and that they should just pull themselves up by the bootstraps? But there is that generational wealth gap that some people obviously forget about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I gave a lecture a couple of weeks ago about the whole issue of housing discrimination. And what's interesting is that, first of all, housing discrimination, which prevented poor people and people of color from buying homes, going back to the policies of the federal government during the New Deal, during World War II, and afterwards, were an important impediment to wealth. And why that's important is because what a lot of economists have said is that the most effective way to transfer wealth from one generation to the next is through the ownership of property, and the ownership of a house. Because what it allows you to do is several things. First of all, if you own a house and it increases in value, you have equity in that house. The equity becomes money that you can use for a variety of things. For example, if you have a challenge in your family finances, you can turn to the equity to sort of tide you over. If you have kids who want to go to college, you can use that equity to help them go into college. If your children want to buy a house, you can use that equity to help them have a down payment towards a house. All these things are important, or when you pass away, they sell the house and that money then goes on to the next generation. If you don't have the ability, or if you're blocked from the ability to purchase a home that you can own, all those options are gone. And most importantly, the option to pass wealth on to the next generation are gone as well. And for the next generation, if the laws of discrimination for buying housing continue, and they still continue today, it makes it hard for that next generation to be able to accumulate property and to really develop wealth. So that I think what we have to understand is there are a number of sort of systemic things in the society that make it hard for you to just work hard and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. There are lots of activities in the society that block the ability to do that. And we need to better understand that, and then find ways to remove those blocks so that people can have a better opportunity to really increase their wealth and the wealth of future generations.
Thank you.
One thing that we're being asked, Sheena, is since we had some technical difficulties earlier, was if Dr. Crew could review the information about the stone that was on slide 2. So I can pull that slide back up, and we can have a look at that real quick. There are several people that have asked about that. So let me go ahead and get that pulled up.
And while he's doing that, Dr. Stone, what you just shared shows us that we can still see the remnants or the enduring effects of slavery even today, over 150 years later. Yeah. And that's pretty profound. It's pretty profound.
Oh, it is. Well, people also say is the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, is a great thing. But what it left open was the exploitation of people who were convicted of a crime. Mm-hmm. And a lot of individuals argue that also has helped to create a heavier impact on communities of color around the issues of crime and being arrested and put in incarceration. So there are lots of different things we can look to that are really working against success for certain groups. Mm-hmm. This stone or block you see here, as I said, was on display for many, many years in Hagerstown, Maryland. And what it talked about, as you can see from the plate, is it says that General Andrew Jackson, who later becomes president, and Henry Clay, who's a very important member of Congress during this period, spoke from this slave block in Hagerstown during the year 1830. And this became the focus point of why this was important and why the town was very proud of it. What it leaves out is the fact of what it meant that this was a slave block for those who were put on this block and then auctioned off and sold to other individuals. And I like this because it's an example of how meanings to objects and artifacts that we can find ways of exploring the meanings and using them to better understand another aspect, a different side of the history of the United States.
Thank you. I have one more question. Thank you for recapping that information.
Sure.
One more question that I'm really interested in hearing. You were the first Black director of the NMAH, Smithsonian Institution. That's history in and of itself, and thank you for your hard work there. And I'm just so proud to know you, sir. But reflecting on that, as well as your work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, what would you say to people, especially people who are disenfranchised or have a legacy that prevented them from having historical documentation and anything about their heritage? What would you say to them about preserving their own heritage, their family history, stories, cultural items, etc.? And one day when we talk, I'll tell you a story about my grandma. But what would you say, and how would you express the importance of doing that?
Well, I'll put it in the context of a couple contexts. The one is what you mentioned in my resume is an exhibition that I did at the American History Museum called African American Migration. And what we tried to do is to tell the story of the migration of African Americans from the South to the North during and after World War I. To do that exhibition, we really had to find objects and artifacts in order to illustrate that experience. And what was important for me in creating that exhibition was that of artifacts at the National Museum of American History at that time did not include a great deal of African American related materials. So one of the things that I really had to do was to begin to travel around giving lectures, but also talking to people about trying to find and collect and bring to the museum artifacts and objects that would help me tell this story of African American migration. What made that exhibition, I think, work so well was I was able to make contact with a lot of different people who had saved things over the years that helped to tell that story. So for me, at the museum and for museums, we cannot tell the story of African American history in museums without having the object and the artifact. So, so selfishly for us, having you save those things are important in order for us to be able to tell that story and to share it with a much larger community. But I think it's also important to share those things just for your own personal history, so you can understand better where you come from, what your ancestors experienced, and how their lives shape your lives today. And those can be really wonderful things. And the great thing about objects is you feel like you have almost direct contact with the individual in one way or another, that somehow their DNA is rubbed off on it. And now you can connect back to them and just sort of feel closer to them in those kind of ways. And preserving that history is so important to have because it gives you a much clearer sense of who you are and why your family is the way it is. And that's a great insight to have about yourself.